Talked about self-image last week. We're going to take the next step today. For those who do not know him, that is Tom Petty. Passed away a few years ago. Tremendous songwriter for himself and for others. 4-decade-long career. Extremely influential in the music industry. For those who do know him, what is the immediate impression when we say Tom Petty? Probably that of a stoner, of this doobie smoking dude. He is constantly, if you know his music, singing about marijuana and joints and Mary Jane and LSD, and he presents this image of a druggie. And yet, very interestingly, that's not the case. I heard him do an interview, and he said, every blue moon or so, I might have a toke on somebody else's, but it's not an advised way to live your life. And it was not a regular part of his life. So the point, regardless his claim that he was not into the drug culture of the 60s and 70s, regardless what he says in an interview, and I have no reason to doubt him, his image through his music will always be one of a stoner. Now let that sink in. He said, that's not me. Maybe the people around me, but that's not me. Image. What we present to the world, what we put out there, the claim that is being made in our lives can actually overpower who we really are. As Christians, we have nailed down this idea this year that Christ and God are at the center of everything. Center of our self-image last week. He is the reason we are what we are, who we are, and what we're able to do. This week, our image that we take out into the world, everything that I do in the workplace, everything that I present in social media, everything that comes out of my mouth, everything that appears on my body must be God-centered to present the image of Christ to this world. So we're going to work through our text, and then we're going to look at a supplemental text for a little bit, and we're going to come back and make some specific application. But the text is Colossians chapter 1. In verses 1 through 8, as Paul opens up this letter, he does what he does. He tells the church he's thankful for them. He tells them that he has been keeping up with them. He tells them that he has regular updates on what is going on in the local congregation and even in individual lives. And in this case, he tells the church at Colossae, look, I'm very thankful for you. I was very thankful when we got the report of the work that Epaphras was doing with you guys. You're constantly in our prayers. Ever since we've heard of your faith, ever since we heard of your love, ever since we heard the fact that you obeyed the gospel, and then he goes back and he reemphasizes that this is a congregation of love. Ever since that moment, he said, we have been praying. Watch this in verse 9. With all they have going on, all the good, the fact that they are faithful, the fact that their faith is strong, the fact that they're loving, that they've been obedient to the gospel, He said, because we've heard all of those things about you, in verse 9, from that very moment on, look what he's about to come back around and say. We have continued to pray. I was praying for you at the beginning of the letter. Got all this wonderful news about you. Now I'm continuing to pray. Why? What would Paul have on his prayer list for the church at Colossae? They seem to have everything moving in the right direction. So what do they need? What is the next step? With all the good that's going on, what would Paul's prayer for that congregation be? You know, we could see why Corinth would be on his prayer list. They're a hot mess. They need all the prayer they can get. We could understand if the churches of Asia Minor that John and Jesus are addressing in Revelation are on Paul's prayer list, because some of them are kind of astray. But Colossae has it all in line. So what's his prayer? Look at it. This reason, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you, to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will. So faith and a belief system were not enough. Obedience to the gospel, the process of hearing and repenting and confessing and being immersed in the waters of baptism and being raised, those were not enough. Love that He multiplies was not enough. He said, you need knowledge of His will. You need to understand how God thinks and what He wants in your life. He said, beyond that knowledge, He said, you need understanding too. So a step towards wisdom. You need to take the knowledge and process it and understand what He's asking of you. So that, watch the wording, so you can walk worthy. You letting that sink in? Walk worthy, now let this settle, to please Him. Do you get the weight of that? Love was not enough to please God. Faith, coming to believe, was not enough to please Him. Obeying the gospel, extra love, was not enough to please Him. He said you have to take those things and add knowledge and understanding so that you could walk in a way that will please Him. They had to do more. It was not enough for Paul to get a good report that they were a solid congregation. It wasn't enough that they were checking off their boxes. He said there is a way that you have to walk in this life that either pleases Him or, what's the opposite? Does not please Him. If they have to walk worthy to please Him, if they do not walk worthy, what is the automatic conclusion? They're not pleasing Him. They have to live it. It has to be a part of their daily lives. Why? Because our image, the way we walk, you can put the word conduct there, carry, present. The way we live our lives reflects directly on Him. And everybody can tell if He's at the center of our image or not. I said there's a supplemental text. It's Ephesians chapter 4. And it happened to be the one that Bob chose for his Bible class Wednesday night as the reading. Ephesians chapter 4, the church at Ephesus must have a similar problem to Colossae. Walk, but do not do so. Do not walk, do not act, do not conduct yourselves like the world, like the Gentiles, those that are still on the outside looking in. So he basically tells them, look around your world, and the image being presented by everybody else around you, exit out. Do not look like your world. Do not act like your world. He then says they have futile thinking, useless, doesn't have a purpose. Their thinking is not going to get them where they need to be. It's not going to turn them into who they are supposed to be. So we got knowledge. Remember, we're paralleling with Colossians 1. And that's led to, because their thinking is useless, it's led to darkened understanding, the opposite of light. They haven't taken the knowledge that they were supposed to have and turned it into an understanding that changed their lives. The Gentiles. And so he's telling them at Ephesus, as you look around and you see that, that cannot be you. He said, those people are excluded. Those people are left out. They're on the outside looking in because of their ignorance, because they do not have the knowledge. They do not have the softened heart that's been touched by the message. In fact, he describes them as callous. In the Old Testament, we see the phrase, no longer able to blush. The Gentile world could present absolutely any image to the world and it not bother them. They could post anything, they could wear anything, they could say anything, they could go anywhere, do anything they wanted to, and their conscience was not bothered by it. Said they do that because they're allowing sensuality, physical desires to control them. The will of God was not at the center of the Gentile world. Physical pleasure, desire was. That led them to practice absolutely everything that was impure. We see that list in Romans chapter 1 as he's describing that Gentile world there. And now to the church at Ephesus, Paul says, that's not what you learned. That's not what we taught you. We didn't stand there and preach Jesus Christ to you and then tell you that you could go out into the world and present absolutely any image that you wanted to present. And then he kind of snidely says, you know, I'm not really sure you learned anything at all. He said, if you learned Christ at all, it wasn't the one we were preaching. The old life, continuing in Ephesians 4, is out the door. The one that we were in that Gentile world. The new life is in. Old image out, new image in. And notice this, that life is in the likeness of God. So they were being called, the Colossians were being called, we are being called to present an image that is in the likeness of God, that is righteous, in line with God, and holy. Does that register? Not just that I have to be that, but that I have to be that and then present it in the likeness of God so the world sees it. I can't make a claim of what I am on the inside and present something else and them line up. Back to our idea of image. What we live, what we carry around as the image we're presenting on a daily basis, what we put out there when we go to school, what we put out there when we're in our homes, what we put out there when we're at work, what we put out there when we're driving down the road, what we put out there when we're standing in line at Walmart, matters. It makes a difference. Paul wrote to 2 different churches, and you can actually find that term walk and walk worthy, walk in the right way in other letters too. Paul is sending these churches and saying what you do in this world that other people see matters. The image we put out there, reflects. He said, you're going to present yourself in the likeness of God. Well, if I miss the likeness of God and I present something else, but I carry the name Christian, God has that image. Because, see, they don't know Him. So all they're seeing is my image. And I'm making a claim that I'm a child of God. I'm making a claim that I'm a Christian. And so it's reflecting on Him. Go back to Colossians. I want you to get this for sure. The image I put out there either pleases Him or displeases Him. Did you know God checks social media? Did you know God listens to our jokes? Did you know God witnesses how we treat each other? That He hears how we talk to one another and the language that we use? And He's either pleased by it or He's displeased. There's no in between those two. There's no third alternative. He falls on one side or the other. So, the specifics. What's your image? If someone was going to use your life to describe a Christian, if someone was going to use your life to describe the image of God, what would the image be? What would be their definition of righteousness? What would be their definition of holiness? What would their understanding be of God's image? So what's your image in your language? Is it pure? Is it holy? Does it present the right reverence towards the Father? Towards the church? Or is it questionable? Are the phrases and the acronyms on the questionable side? So what's your image in your language? Back to Colossians 1. Does it please Him? Or does it displease Him? You're not answering to me. You're not answering to the elders. You're not answering to the world. It either pleases or displeases Him. What is your image in your social media? Can someone visit your page or see your snap or read your tweet and say, that's what a Christian's supposed to look like? Or do they look at it and say, did I really see his car in the parking lot at Mount Carmel Sunday morning and now he's going to put that out there? What's your image in your clothes? Are they godly? Are they chaste? Do they cover what God told you to cover? Do they say things that God would want you to say? God checks our wardrobe. Believe it or not, as busy as God is with all the multitude of things He has to do, He checks our social media, He listens to our language, checks out our clothes. He observes our attitude. What's your image and your attitude? Are you a hard worker or are you slothful? Are you grateful or are you grumbling? Do you have joy or are you miserable? Does it please Him or not? What's your image and your attendance? Does it matter? God's a number checker. If you don't believe me, go back and look how many times He talks about counting this and counting that. God keeps up with numbers. So does the image that I present and how I feel about worship and how I feel about communing with the saints and how I feel about fellowship, does it please Him? Or does it displease Him? What's my image with service? Do I show up when I'm given the privilege of serving? Or do I pass it off to somebody else? Do I look for any and every excuse to not touch the lives of Christians around me? Does my service please Him or displease Him? What's my image and my priorities? Let you do an interesting test sometime. We're really good, if we want to sit down and write out our priorities, of putting as number one what we know should be number one, whether it is in our lives or not. And number two and number... Let the person who knows you absolutely best in the world write out your priorities for you. Do they please Him? Or do they please you? That list can go on, but I want you to understand what we put out into the world, where we go, what we say, what we do, the way we do, matters because it reflects on the one who gave us His name. And what we put out there either pleases Him or it breaks His heart. Because He gave His Son for us. The precious blood that we just talked about was given intentionally for us. And we're going to be washed in it and we're going to represent it, but we're not going to do it right. It breaks His heart. So what's your image? Is your image centered on God? Or is it centered on self? That's the two struggles. We're going to talk about where that image change begins tonight. In preview of that image change begins at Calvary. It requires the blood of the Lamb to wash away the old so the new can begin. But then there is this ongoing process of this transformation that takes place, where I allow God to step by step reel in the things in my life that are not in sync with Him. Don't misunderstand, it's a process. I don't come out of the water and have everything in my life fixed at one time. All the habits don't disappear. So there's a process, but it has to start in Calvary. If you've never been buried in the water that puts you in contact with the blood of the Lamb this morning, so that you were raised in new life, please respond to the invitation. But a lot of this lesson has been for those of us who've already obeyed the gospel. What's your image? What do people see when they look at you? Is it God at the center of everything? Or is it self as we stand and sing?